Hello, I'm Mark Licht. I'm an assistant professor and extension cropping systems specialist here with Iowa State University. And today we're going to talk about corn growth and development. And I'm going to talk a little bit about staging, but then also some of the key growth stages where there's more importance to be paying attention to what might be stressing the crop at. So just to start off with the corn staging method that we're going to use, we're going to follow the leaf collar method. This is what most of the research world is using and is pretty common to be found. And so what we're really paying attention to with the leaf collar method is identifying that leaf collar where the leaf sheath and the leaf blade meet. That juncture is what the leaf collar is. You can note that it's just a little bit paler green color there. Now, obviously, this is a more mature plant, and so that leaf collar or that stalk is a little bit thicker diameter. And so what we're really looking for is when the margins of the leaf collar kind of separate around the stalk and are no longer tied up in the whorl of the growing plant, growing shoot. Occasionally, as we get out into the latter leaf stages, vegetative stages, we start to sometimes need to be able to stage, but we can't find all the leaves to be able to count them appropriately. And so there on the right-hand side is just a split stalk, and it starts to illustrate our other two options, really, of doing leaf staging. So generally speaking, if you just have to have a ballpark idea, you can assume that the sixth node is attached to the sixth leaf, and that sixth node is typically at the soil surface. And then your seventh node there would be above the soil surface. As you get into the late vegetative stages, there may even be some brace roots coming out of that node. So the sixth node there, if you really have to be specific, you'd want to slice open that stalk and start to identify the sixth node versus the fifth node, which are going to be separated by about 1/4 of an inch. Nodes 1 through 4 are compressed together with a slight, maybe 1/8 of an inch inner node between the fourth and the fifth nodes. So then that's really the process that we go through as far as doing the vegetative staging. I'll get into the reproductive staging as we get further into this presentation. So when we think about developmental staging, corn is a very sequentially growing plant. So it is a determinate plant, and so we have a clean break between the vegetative and the reproductive staging, growth and development. As far as the vegetative staging, obviously we start out with emergence, and then we start talking about the first leaf, second leaf, third leaf, as those leaf collars are no longer touching around the stalk. And that can go clear out through the last vegetative stage, which is tasseling. And then we move right into the reproductive staging, which is the silking, blister, milk, dough, dent, and physiological maturity. Now, those reproductive staging, I'll show you some examples, but we're really observing the kernels and the ears to be able to do that staging based on observation. So when we do the vegetative staging, we can be somewhat predictive as well. And so there's been a number of research projects that have identified that heat unit accumulation really works well. In Iowa, we use this chart, which from emergence out to the 10th leaf stage takes about 84 growing degree days or heat units per leaf initiation or per stage. After that V10, then it slightly decreases to 56 growing degree days per leaf. And so this is a pretty good and easy way to start predicting out how fast the leaves are going to be out, how fast we're going to progress through those vegetative stages. We can do the same thing on the reproductive stages as well. Although with the reproductive stages, typically we're using the number of days from one stage to the next. And really a good break point, if you think about it, is you go from pollination to the dent stage in about 30 days. And then that dent stage is really a dry down phase. And that takes approximately another 30 days. So as we think about the growing season, obviously not necessarily a growth stage, but our critical time frame here is the planting season. And so when we want to think about getting uniform germination and emergence, we need to really think about those conditions that we're putting that seed into. With corn, we look at soil temperatures of 50 degrees Fahrenheit and rising. Soil moisture is critically important just because that really helps us get that seed to germinate and uniformly emerge. A lot of years, at least in Iowa and parts of the Corn Belt, we get worried more so about too much moisture. But as we think about the Western Corn Belts, the Great Plains states, all of a sudden we start thinking about it being too dry. And so there's some things and some considerations around that soil moisture that need to be thought about. Adequate seed to soil contact. So if the soils are light, fluffy, more mellow, we need to make sure that we're getting that seed to soil contact so we can imbibe that water into that seed. The favorable forecast really comes back to making sure that we have those soil temperatures at 50 degrees or better, especially in that 3 to 5 day window, because that's really what could affect seedling vigor if we do get any cold injury there. So northern Corn Belt, or if we're pushing our planting a little bit too early, that's really where we need to be paying attention to that 3, 5, 7 day forecast. So our first stage is that emergent stage, or VE. And this is defined simply as when that coleoptile is visible above the soil surface. And so it can just really be the tip of it, and often it's quite yellow when it first comes out. Within a few days, then you'll start seeing that first leaf appearance, but it's going to be tied up or in that whorl shoot development still. And so you'll still be at the VE stage here with that plant there on the right-hand side. As we think about going in the early vegetative stages, VE1 to V6, from a staging perspective, our first leaf typically has a rounded tip, and so this is a good identifier because you can start to recognize if you've lost leaves as you get a thicker stalk, or if you're in drier, windier conditions. Some of those initial leaves do start to disappear, especially as you get out to V6, 7, and 8 time frame. In this plant here, you can see the first true leaf there, and then the second leaf there's hanging off to the right-hand side. That collar is separated away from the stalk or the growing leaf tissue still. The third leaf, yes, it is there. It is got more leaf area, more biomass than that second leaf, but the leaf collars are still wrapped around the whorl. So we would not be at the V3 stage. So in this time frame, it's important to remember that the growing point is still below the soil surface. So we can get defoliation, whether it's from hail or whether it's from insect feeding, and we can still get the plant to regrow from that growing point and push through the soil surface, put out new leaves. In this picture here, you can also see the juncture between the coleoptile and the mesocotyl, where we have nodal roots developing. And so by V2, you should be able to see some nodal roots. Even at V1, you may see some very initial growth of that nodal root. V1, V2, we're still very much relying on the seminal and radical roots for nutrient and water uptake. We start transitioning around V3 into that nodal root system as far as providing nutrients and water with it. The sixth leaf stage, this is now when we consider that growing point to be above the soil surface. All of the vegetative tissue has now been initiated and developed. It's just not fully grown. Obviously, by the time we get to V6, those nodal roots have really taken over, and they're supplying the water, they're supplying nutrients, they're anchoring that plant into place. And so you can really see this in this image here. You can kind of see the soil line in that first leaf, and even that second leaf on a V6 plant could be desiccating, could be blown away, depending on the type of weather conditions that we have. At this stage of the game, those roots are growing quite rapidly. V6 is also critical from the standpoint of now we're starting to initiate the ear development. And so what we're really looking at here is if you have some sort of a stress, whether it be a chemical stress, whether it be a climate type stress, you could reduce the number of kernel rows that you have. So typically, we like to see 18 kernel rows or 16 kernel rows, but if you have a major stress right here at that V6 time frame, even at V7, you may see something of a reduction of 14 or 12 kernel rows, or you may see at the butt of the ear there may be 18, and at the tip of the ear there may be 14. And then again, that's just an indicator that there was some sort of a stress right here around the V6 staging time frame. V9 plant, again, just to show you that at this time, if you were to dissect the plant, you can now notice where the primary ear is with the ear shoot developed there, as well as ear shoots at every node below that primary ear. So at this stage of the game, that primary ear shoot is very small compared to the ear shoots below it. In the next weeks after this stage, you would see that ear shoot taking dominance and really growing quite a bit more rapidly than the ear shoots below it. By V15, now you've transitioned from obviously the ear initiation at V6, but you were producing ovules from V6 clear out to about V15. V15, now you're seeing, if you were to dissect out those ears, you would see that silk elongation starting to occur. Silks start to elongate at the base of the ear, and then it progresses toward the tip. I point this out because right around this late vegetative time period, I'll say V15, V16, V17, water use by the plant drastically increases because these silks require a lot of water. They're 95+% water in those silks. And so if we have any sort of moisture stress, it can slow the elongation of those and growth of those silks. So really want to be careful to avoid stresses there, whether it's heat stress or moisture stress, or anything else that would disrupt the uptake of water there. Tasseling, this stage here is denoted by all the tassel branches being visible. This is not an indicator at all of pollen shed. So in some cases, the main tassel will be shedding pollen, but the tassel branches may still be confined within the flag leaf. And so we're really looking for all those tassels to be visible before we say we're at the VT growth stage. Now, having said that, silking is that R1 growth stage, so it's our transition from vegetative to reproductive. But the silking stage, due to genetics and plant breeding, often can occur before we get to that official tasseling stage. So in some respects, we can go from our late vegetative stages directly into silking and skip right over the tassel stage. So I should just reinforce that the silking stage is when we start to see silks emerging outside of the husk. And so again, what really has happened through plant breeding is we're getting those silks receptive at the time of pollen shed starting. And so we're synchronizing pollen shed and the silk emergence, quite honestly. So, and then what that does is that extends out the amount of time that we have for pollination to occur. Just at the R1 stage, something else to note is that the root system of these corn plants is now essentially maximum. We've maxed it out. You will get, obviously, maintenance of that root system. You're still having nutrient uptake. You're still having water uptake. And you will have a little bit of growth, but it's just greatly minimized at this stage because the photoassimilates are now being directed toward the ear and grain fill. So jumping right into the reproductive stages. So R1 is that silk emergence and pollination. R2, now what we're looking at is the individual kernels. We call this the blister stage. And this is the growth stage immediately following fertilization of that ovule. We're, again, very high water demand at this stage because what we're really doing and then what the plant's doing is it's enlarging that kernel envelope. So we're developing out that kernel size and filling it with water. So 85% moisture. If you were to feel these kernels, they're going to be very plump. If you break them open, they're going to be a mostly clear liquid, maybe a little bit of white coloring to it. As we move into continuing that process, now we're into the milk stage. Again, these kernels are going to be very plump, very firm, and we're still developing the kernel size for the most part, as well as starting to put in some starches into that. So if you break open these kernels, again, we're looking for the consistency and coloring of the interior, and it's going to be more of a milky type fluid that you're going to notice. A little bit lower on the moisture at 80% compared to the blister stage, but we're still really filling that kernel up and developing kernel size and just starting to get a little bit of starch accumulation in the kernel. R4 stage is the dough stage. So here we're really starting to see starch accumulation ramp up. The embryo is being developed. So you break these kernels open. They're probably not quite as fluid. They're not as plump. And so when you break those open, they're going to have more of a doughy consistency to them. The moisture level comes down a little bit because we're starting to accumulate that starch in there. The fifth stage is the dent stage. And so in our commodity production, we're producing dent corn. And so what you're really looking for is on the outside of those kernels, as the starch comes in and as they dry out, that pericarp does dent in a little bit. So this is generally about halfway through the reproductive staging. Again, we're putting a lot more starch in, so the moisture content of that kernel does come down. And so the other part of this stage, because the dent stage is so long, a lot of times we do talk about a milk line to indicate how far through the dent stage we are. So here, just an ear split apart. On the right-hand side, you probably don't want to use that side because that side is not going to show the milk line progression because that's where the embryo is. On the left-hand side is the portion of the ear that you can really see that milk line progression. The first ring on the outside of that is where we would kind of term as 25% milk line, and then 50%, then 75% milk line as you move closer in, as that starch accumulation continues. It continues from the outside moving in, and so the outside of the kernel is drier than toward the tip of the kernel. And then our final growth stage is physiological maturity. This happens roughly 60 to 65 days after pollination. If you're in northern latitudes where you're using shorter season hybrids, this is going to be a little bit earlier than 65 days. If you're in the southern growing regions, this may be a little bit longer. We reach physiological maturity when that corn grain moisture is roughly about 35% moisture. It is something to note that, yes, this is when we have viable kernels, but we actually have some viable embryos back in the dough stage, but the quality, because of dry down, because of storage, is much less. And so we do really want it to be at physiological maturity before we really harvest and truly say we have a high-quality, viable seed. Following physiological maturity is when we will get a black layer or an abscission layer. This usually is right around 30% moisture, 28% moisture when that abscission layer forms, and you're able to split the seed open and see that black layer there at the tip of the kernel. This is just a good sign that you're no longer getting movement from the kernel to the plant or from the plant to the kernel. At this stage of the game, moisture loss is occurring through the seed coat. It's occurring through the husk. And so identifying the black layer is just a good predictable way to say, yes, we've made it to past physiological maturity, and we know that it's roughly 28 to 30% grain moisture at that time frame. So very quickly went through staging, some key growth stages to kind of start to think about, when we see stressors, what effect that might have on grain yield or some of our grain weights or other yield components. If you do have any questions for me, feel free to contact me. I'd be more than willing to respond back via email or even a phone call. Thank you.